Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be, well, deep diving into a topic that's both super relevant and honestly kind of fascinating. We're talking about spousal selection, but we're going way beyond just like your typical dating advice.
Right. We're really trying to understand all those social and cultural factors that are playing a role in how young people are approaching marriage today.
Exactly. And what's really cool about this deep dive is that we're getting these insights from, well, a pretty unique source. A really lively discussion between like this relationship expert and a community leader. And it's all in an Urdu language YouTube video. So we're getting this whole other perspective on things.
It's true. And what makes it so fascinating is that we're not just looking at it from a Western point of view. We're seeing how, Islamic principles and these cultural nuances are all kind of coming together, and especially how they're intersecting with this whole modern dating landscape, which is so different than it used to be.
Totally. And one of the first things that really jumped out at me that the expert brought up was how much the whole dating scene has changed, especially for young men. And he uses this analogy, it's a little out there, but it really makes you think. He compares it to a world where you can get milk, like, everywhere, super easy to access, versus a world where you have to own a cow to get milk.
It's a powerful image, right? What he's getting at is how casual relationships and the influence of social media have totally shifted the dynamics around marriage. In this oversupply situation, as he calls it, it's easy to see why some men might not feel the same urgency to settle down as they might have in the past.
Yeah, it's almost like the whole dating game has flipped. It used to be that men, they kind of had the upper hand. But now, with all these options, some guys are like taking their time, they're becoming a lot more selective, and they're coming up with these really, really long checklists of what they're looking for in a potential spouse.
For sure. And that brings up the question, how are young women navigating all of this, this changing landscape? Because they're facing this pressure not only from potential partners, but also from society at large and even their families.
Absolutely. There's this expectation, that they'll find a suitable husband, get married by a certain age. And on top of that, there's this internal conflicts that many women face. Like how to balance those expectations with, their own ambitions, education, career goals, and the desire to start a family eventually. It's a lot to juggle.
Yeah, no kidding. I actually laughed out loud when they talked about some women bringing these super long, super detailed checklists to meetings with potential partners.
Oh yeah, it's like they're interviewing for a job. But seriously, it shows how much thought and effort many women are putting into this process.
Absolutely. They're trying to find that sweet spot where they can meet their own needs while also navigating, all those cultural expectations and getting at, all important parental approval.
It's a lot.
It is. And the expert in the video, he had some advice for young women, encouraging them to be, open to potential matches that maybe their family suggests, to have these really honest conversations with their parents about what they're looking for, and really try to figure out their own priorities.
Yeah. So both men and women are dealing with these really interesting and sometimes complicated dynamics. But I'm curious about the things that might actually make or break a potential match. Like, what are the deal breakers?
Well, the video goes into this idea of deal breakers, and it gets pretty interesting. The expert talks about how, for a lot of men, there's this innate desire for what's called qawwam in Arabic. And it's basically this idea of being the protector and provider for their family. It's deeply rooted in Islamic teachings, and it plays a really significant role in how they approach marriage.
That makes sense. So how does that play out in terms of like what they're looking for in a partner?
Well, they want to feel like they can fulfill that role. And certain traits, in a potential partner might make them question if they can do that. For example, if a woman is seen as, rebellious or challenges their authority, especially in areas they feel responsible for, like safety, they could be a deal breaker for some men.
It sounds like cultural nuances play a big role here, because what might be considered rebellious in one context might be totally normal in another.
Oh, for sure. And it can be tricky, right? Because these perceptions are often shaped by cultural norms and expectations.
Totally. And speaking of cultural nuances, the video also talked about some of the common deal breakers for women. What were some of those?
So they mentioned things like drug use, alcohol abuse, things that could impact the stability and well-being of the family, and also the overall religious and social environment of a potential partner's family was a big one.
It makes sense. Women are often looking for a partner who shares their values, who will create a stable and supportive environment for, raising a family. And that definitely includes the family they're marrying into.
Right, and it can go beyond just values. There's this idea of wife material that the expert mentioned, where some men specifically look for partners from families they already know, families they trust, and it's seen as a way to, ensure that there's that social compatibility and that things will run smoothly within the family unit.
I could see how that would be appealing, especially in cultures where family ties are so strong. It's like you're not just marrying an individual, you're marrying into a whole network of relationships.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important aspect of spousal selection, the role of the family. And let's be real, this can be a tricky area to navigate, both for parents and for the young people involved.
Oh, yeah, there's often so much pressure, especially in certain cultures, to say yes to proposals quickly, maybe out of fear of, missing out on a good match. And sometimes parental insecurities or even just, interference can make things even more complicated.
Absolutely. And this is where that open communication piece is so important, especially between parents and their daughters. In Islam, a woman has the right consent to her marriage. It's not just about parental approval, it's about her voice, her choice. And experts, they actually shared some anecdotes from their own lives about how they've tried to create space for their children to make their own informed decisions.
I love that. It's so refreshing to hear these experts acknowledging the challenges and advocating for a more balanced approach.
Me too. And they didn't shy away from addressing some of those more serious issues that can come up within families. Like they issued this really strong warning to parents about the dangers of, hiding their children's flaws just to try and secure a marriage.
Yeah, it's like they're saying don't sweep things under the rug.
Exactly. They were particularly concerned about situations where parents might try to hide things like addiction or anger management issues, thinking that marriage will magically solve those problems. And they were very clear that this is incredibly harmful and it can have devastating consequences for both people involved.
Yeah. I mean, honesty and transparency are so important. Trying to build a relationship on a foundation of secrets, it's never going to be stable.
Right. And they went on to talk about anger management in more detail, which seems to be a growing concern even outside of the context of marriage. They suggested that having those open conversations about, each other's strengths and weaknesses, including how they handle anger, should be a part of the process.
So not just waiting for a red flag to pop up, but proactively talking about these things.
Exactly. And they pointed out that men and women often express anger in different ways. They mentioned how men are often more outwardly aggressive while women might be more passive aggressive. It was funny because, they had that little anecdote.
About how women always identify other women as the biggest troublemakers.
Yes, it was hilarious. But it also made me think about those subtle dynamics, those power dynamics that you often see playing out, especially within families and communities.
Oh, absolutely. Relationships, especially family relationships, they can be so complex. And it sounds like we're just scratching the surface here.
We are, and in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore some more of the experts' advice on how to navigate these complexities and make wise choices when it comes to finding a life partner.
It's like we were saying, honesty is so important. And the experts really pushed for open communication about everything, even, tougher topics like anger management, which got me thinking, how do you actually assess that in a potential partner? Like, do you just wait for them to, I don't know, blow up about something?
It's a good question, and the experts had some really practical advice. They emphasize that having those conversations about, strengths and weaknesses is so important. It's not about, expecting perfection or anything like that. It's about understanding how a person handles their emotions, especially under pressure. How do they deal with conflict?
Right. So not just waiting for a red flag, but actually asking those questions directly. Like, hey, how do you typically deal with conflict?
Exactly. And it's interesting because they pointed out that men and women sometimes express anger in very different ways. They mentioned how men are often more, outwardly aggressive, while women might be more passive aggressive, which I don't know about you, but I found that pretty relatable.
Oh, totally. It reminded me of that part where the expert joked about women always saying that other women are the biggest troublemakers. It was hilarious, but it also got me thinking about those subtle dynamics, those power dynamics that you see playing out, especially within families and communities.
For sure. Relationships, especially those family ties, can be so complex.
Speaking of families, I was really struck by how the experts addressed the whole issue of parental influence in spousal selection. Because there's so much pressure in some cultures, right, to say yes to proposals quickly, maybe out of fear that their son or daughter might miss out.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of parental insecurities or even interference, which, can add this whole other layer of complexity. But I was really happy to hear them emphasize a woman's right to consent in Islam. because, it's not just about getting your parents' approval. It's about the woman feeling comfortable and confident in her decision. It's her choice.
It's so important. And they even shared a story, a personal anecdote, about how they approached this with their own children. Making it clear that their kids had the right to say no to a potential match, even if, the parents really like the person. Which is huge, especially in cultures where parental authority can be so strong.
It really is, and it speaks volumes about the need for open communication and mutual respect within families, even when there are differences of opinion. It's about creating that space for honest conversation.
Totally agree. And this idea of open communication, it goes beyond the parent-child relationship, right? I mean, the experts also had some really interesting insights about navigating those tricky in-law dynamics. Because let's face it, who hasn't heard those mama's boy stories?
It's a classic for a reason, right? And they addressed it head on, which I appreciated. They talked about the importance of setting clear boundaries early on, making sure there's that healthy separation between the marital relationship and the parent-child relationship. It's not about cutting off your family or anything like that. It's about creating a space where the marriage can actually thrive and where both partners feel, you know, respected and heard.
And like you were saying before, it takes a good amount of emotional intelligence for both the couple and the families involved. Being able to understand your own emotions, manage them effectively, and also, empathize with others.
But
Because families are complicated.
they are, and alongside open communication and emotional intelligence, the experts also brought up the role of faith in decision making. Specifically, they talked about istikhara, which is a specific prayer in Islam where you seek guidance from God when you're facing a major decision. And I think this is something that a lot of people, regardless of their religious background, can relate to.
It is, because we all want that reassurance, that guidance when we're making big life choices. But what I found interesting was that they didn't present istikhara as like, a magic 8 ball that gives you a yes or no answer. It's not about that. It's more about finding that peace, that clarity within yourself.
Exactly. They emphasize that sometimes the path forward, the best path, isn't necessarily the one you initially expected. But by seeking divine guidance and trusting in God's wisdom, you can have that comfort in knowing that you're on the right track, even if it takes you down a road you didn't foresee. It's about surrendering to that bigger plan.
It's a beautiful concept, really. And it doesn't mean that you just, give up your own agency or ignore practical considerations. It's about integrating your faith into the process, finding that balance between seeking that higher guidance and taking responsibility for your own actions.
It is, and that's what I find so compelling about this whole conversation. It's that blend of practicality and spirituality, because marriage is a big decision. It's not just about, checking off boxes on a compatibility checklist. It's so much deeper than that.
It really is. It's about recognizing the importance of personal growth, the power of honest communication, and the comfort that faith can bring, especially when facing, those major life choices. While we've talked a lot about the personal aspects, the experts also didn't shy away from addressing some of the bigger societal trends that are, impacting how young people view marriage today. It felt like they were really trying to be honest about what's going on in society. They talked about the rising drug use, the struggles with mental health, all the conflicts happening within families. Those aren't exactly easy topics to talk about. And honestly, it made me wonder, how can anyone even think about marriage when there's so much negativity out there?
It's heavy stuff, for sure. And I think it's understandable why all these challenges would be creating this underlying feeling of uncertainty, Especially for young people trying to figure out what they even want in a relationship. It's tough. You see all these broken marriages and you start to think, is this even possible? Can any marriage actually last?
Yeah, it's easy to become cynical and you're surrounded by all these negative examples. It's hard to stay positive sometimes. But, even with all that, the experts in the video, they really did seem optimistic. They still believe in the power of marriage. They believe that you can find lasting happiness with the right person.
It's inspiring, isn't it? And what stood out to me was how much they emphasized education, not just, academics, but education about relationships, communication skills, how to resolve conflict. They're basically saying equip yourself with the tools and knowledge you need to build a strong partnership.
It makes sense, right? I mean, the more you understand about yourself, your partner, all those relationship dynamics, the better prepared you'll be to actually handle the tough stuff when it inevitably comes up.
Absolutely, and that's where open communication comes in again. They were really adamant about being willing to have those hard conversations, to address issues head on, and to seek help when you need it. Because, there's still such a stigma in some cultures around, admitting that you're struggling, like you just have to suck it up and deal with it on your own. But they were really encouraging people to break free from that.
To be vulnerable and speak up for what you need.
Exactly.
Because ultimately, that vulnerability, it's what allows you to build that true connection, that intimacy.
It is. And, at the end of the day, marriage, it's a partnership. It's about two people coming together, each with their own baggage, their strength, their weaknesses, their hopes, their fears, and choosing to build something meaningful together, knowing that you're not always going to see eye to eye on everything, knowing that life throws curveballs and that it takes effort, it takes commitment to weather those storms as a team.
And I think it's so important to remember through it all why you chose each other in the first place. To hold on to that, celebrate the good times, support each other through the hard times, and, celebrate each other's growth along the way.
Because we're all constantly evolving, right? And it's about choosing to love each other through all of that, choosing love even when it's hard. And I think that's a really powerful message, especially in a world that can feel, increasingly divided.
I agree. Well, there you have it, folks. We've reached the end of our deep dive into the fascinating world of spousal selection. I don't know about you, but it's given me a lot to think about.
Me too. It's been a journey. I mean, we've explored how these traditional values are clashing with modern realities, how all these societal pressures can influence our choices. And yet, there's still this hope, this belief in the power of love to create something lasting, something meaningful.
And ultimately, it comes down to, open communication, self-awareness, and for many, that element of faith. It all plays such an important role. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I hope you found it as insightful as I have. So as we wrap up, I wanted to leave you with one final thought. We've talked a lot about the challenges, the things that make finding lasting love difficult. But I'm curious, what gives you hope? What are the positive trends, the inspiring stories that make you believe that true love is still out there?
It's a good question. And as you continue on your own journey, in life and in love, remember to stay curious, keep an open mind, and never stop believing in the power of love to change lives, to make a difference in the world.
Beautifully said. And a huge thank you to all of you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those conversations flowing.